All right, welcome back, everyone. So this is going to be part 3 in our motor pathways lecture. And here we're going to pick up by talking about the brainstem. So along with the motor cortex that we finished in the previous part, we also have neurons, upper motor neurons, that will begin in some region other than the motor cortex. So specifically in a region of the brainstem, right? And we have generally three different pathways that will kind of start or be incorporated in the brainstem. One of these is going to be known as the vestibular pathway, or the vestibulospinal pathway. What this pathway is the term vestibulo is referring to vestibular, it's referring to balance. And so the vestibular pathway has to do with our special sense of equilibrium and balance, and it's coming from our 8th cranial nerve. So the inner ear is providing input into this vestibular nucleus, this kind of vestibular nuclear complex that's in the brainstem, in the pons, and then from there we'll have sensory signals go down to the through the brainstem, through the spinal cord, and then out to the periphery and innervate muscles there that help maintain balance and posture and equilibrium and things like that. All right. Now we also have one called the reticular formation, or something called the reticulospinal pathway. The reticulospinal pathway is doing something similar. It is receiving information. It's also sending information down the brainstem, down the spinal cord, out to muscles that are helping maintain posture and equilibrium, balance, things like that. So with all of these that we're talking about here in this pathway, you can categorize these as being indirect or what are called extrapyramidal pathways, all right? So these indirect or extrapyramidal pathways, we do not have conscious control over these, all right? These are subconscious, these are involuntary, but they're still going to skeletal muscle, all right? Whereas the direct pathway, or the pyramidal pathways that we'll look at in a future part of this lecture, these are voluntarily controlled and are again, going to skeletal muscle, but we have conscious control over the activation of those pathways. So whenever you're choosing to move your hand as you're taking notes, or you're typing, or you're walking, or you're throwing something, right? It is a voluntary action, voluntary movement, and so those muscles are being innervated by a direct or a pyramidal pathway. These here are indirect, extrapyramidal, meaning that they are below our consciousness. They are not within our voluntary control. So the reason that some pathways are called pyramidal and some are called extrapyramidal, one, for what we just said, it's either directly consciously controlled or not, but the pyramidal has to do with a type of neuron called a pyramidal neuron. And there are pyramidal neurons in the cortex, and so if the pathway starts at those, you call it a pyramidal. If it's not, then you call it extrapyramidal. And extra in this case meaning beyond or outside of those neurons, right? So all of these here, and there's one other one called the tectospinal tract that is allowing us to perform motor activities in response to different types of stimuli. So some are auditory stimuli, some are visual stimuli, but all these in general, involuntary movement, posture, balance, muscle tone, all these different types of things here, okay? So another important region of our brain is something known as the basal nuclei, or the basal nucleus, all right? So what this is, what these basal nuclei are deeply located clusters of gray matter that are within the brain, all right? So the reason we call it a nucleus is because, one, it's a cluster of cell bodies. It's in the central nervous system, and so a cluster of cell bodies in the central nervous system is called a nucleus, right? If it was outside of the central nervous system, you would call it a ganglia, right? And so the basal nuclei, you'll also see them sometimes referred to as ganglia, although that's not the most correct term. Descriptively, it's not the most correct, but you will see it used sometimes. It is an older term that sometimes sticks around, right? So, but technically, if you want to be specific, we'll call them basal nuclei. So what these are, they're deeply located, deeply situated clusters of gray matter in the brain, and what these are doing is they're allowing us to regulate, control, modify our motor activity before that activity goes down to the periphery. So in other words, it's largely helping us to get rid of and kind of inhibit motor signals and motor movements that are unnecessary, that are extraneous, that we don't need, all right? So instead of you just thinking I'm thinking about moving my arm, and instead of the signal going directly from the brain to the lower motor neuron out to the muscle, a signal is relayed to these basal nuclei, all right? And the basal nuclei will receive that signal from the cortex. They will modify it through the release of different types of neurotransmitters called acetylcholine and another one called GABA, or gamma amino butyric acid. And these are excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters that will either result in the excitation of movement, so positive for movement, or the inhibition of movement, all right? And so you can see these here. You see the same nuclei or basal ganglia in an actual brain specimen. So you can see caudate nucleus here. So these swellings here, these openings, are the lateral ventricles. And so you see the caudate nucleus kind of in the lateral wall of the lateral ventricle. You see one called the putamen here, and you see the small one down here called the globus pallidus, right? And so you have these pathways that look something like this. And these pathways are going to be called a direct pathway or an indirect pathway, right? So the direct pathway ultimately results in excitation or stimulation of the motor cortex that results in movement, okay? The indirect pathway, in this pathway to the left here, this is the direct pathway, this is the indirect pathway. The indirect pathway ultimately sends an inhibitory signal to the motor cortex that inhibits motor movement, all right? And so you see that you have all these arrows going in different directions, and they are stimulating or inhibiting, or sometimes what's called disinhibiting, different regions of these basal nuclei that result in some type of motor activity, all right? So anything blue that you see is excitatory, the solid red is inhibitory, and then the dashed red that you see, that is what's called disinhibitory, right? So blue, you see, if we're on the left here, blue, this is excitatory, so we excite this, right? When you excite this, these neurons in this region, the striatum, release an inhibitory neurotransmitter that inhibits this small structure here called the globus pallidus, all right? This globus pallidus, because it's inhibited here, it will not release its neurotransmitter, but its neurotransmitter that releases is inhibitory. So if you release less inhibitory neurotransmitters, you're really exciting. So really, you result in the thalamus here, and you get excitation coming back up, and you get stimulation of the motor cortex, right? If you go to the right side, you get basically the opposite. You end up with inhibition of the motor cortex, right? And so all this is doing, these pathways, are helping to regulate the motor activity that's coming out from the brain, and so and thus helping to control motor activity, motor movement, and get rid of unnecessary extra motor movements, right? So an associated structure here in this region is called the substantia nigra. The substantia nigra translates to dark substance, so nigra meaning dark, substantia meaning substance, so you get a dark substance, and it's this region that you see here in the midbrain, right? So these are the cerebral peduncles. So this is the anterior region, this back here, this is the posterior region. And again, these dark regions here, these are the substantia nigra. You have one on the right, you have one on the left. The reason they're dark is they're filled with melanin. The neurons in the region are filled with melanin. And they release something and secrete something called dopamine. And dopamine is a type of neurotransmitter. And in this case, dopamine helps to put a check on the basal ganglia. So it helps to control this system here. And in doing so, it helps to minimize unwanted movements, right? And so in cases like Parkinson's disease has to do with a destruction in the neurons in the substantia nigra. So if you destroy those neurons, you're decreasing the amount of dopamine that's released. And the lack of dopamine in this case is preventing the inhibition of movement, right? So if you're preventing the inhibition of movement, you're actually getting movement, right? And so if you know anyone with Parkinson's disease, you have a family member, you've seen videos, you know that they will have excess, extraneous, involuntary motor movements. So they may have kind of a poor speech pattern. It may be kind of stuttered. They may have involuntary hand movements and arm movements, so things like tremors and shaking. They can have a shuffling gait, and all these have to do with the excess stimulation that is leading to these excess movements, right? So here you can see in this image here, here's the midbrain. Here you see the substantia nigra, the dark melanin in the neurons here, and in this person with Parkinson's disease, you see that it is largely gone. It is not quite as visible, okay? So the last thing that we'll talk about in this part is the cerebellum. So the cerebellum, the word cerebellum translates to little brain or small brain. And so it is this structure here, located posterior to the brainstem. So here's the brainstem, midbrain, pons, medulla. Here is the cerebellum here. Cerebellum is organized in a similar manner to how the cerebrum is, in the sense that there are hemispheres. So there's a left and a right. In the cerebellum, however, you have a midline structure connecting the two called the vermis, and vermis is referring to worm-like, and we'll look at a picture in the next slide. The cerebellum is separated from the cerebrum by something called the transverse fissure, which is just a large groove that separates the two. When you section the cerebellum in a gross specimen, you see these radiating white matter fibers, these tracts, that are called the arbor vitae. And so arbor means tree, vitae is referring to life, and so the arbor vitae means the tree of life, okay? And we'll look at that in a second. And then lastly, they're connected to the brainstem via something called peduncles, right? And a peduncle in anatomy is something that connects one part of the brain to another part, right? And so the one that you can see here is something called the middle cerebellar peduncle, and it's this structure right here, running from the pons here, running into the cerebellum. You also have one, so that's the middle cerebellar peduncle. You have one that's called the superior. You have one that's called the inferior. And these are bringing information into the cerebellum, so sensory information, or they're taking information out of the cerebellum, which would be motor information, right? And so all of these, all these different parts of the cerebellum, they all have to do with balance, equilibrium, posture in the individual, right? And so any disruption in the cerebellar function, you'll have a deficit in your ability to maintain good balance, posture, equilibrium, things like that, right? And so you can look up a video. There are videos on YouTube. You can look up something called cerebellar hypoplasia, and it's a condition that can occur in cats. It may occur in other animals, I'm not 100% sure, but it can for sure occur in cats. And it's a condition in which the cerebellum is underdeveloped in these cats, and their ability to maintain good posture and balance and equilibrium is severely hindered, and you see them falling and stumbling, and they appear to be very disorganized. They kind of appear as though they're intoxicated, all right? So if you look here you can see our cerebellum. So again, here's the same image we looked at first. So here's one hemisphere. Here is if we took a section of it. So here you can see middle cerebellar peduncle here. If you look at this, you can see the superior coming down, and then down here you see the inferior cerebellar peduncle coming up, right? You see right hemisphere, you see left hemisphere, and in the midline, you see the vermis, and that vermis is meaning worm, that's connecting the two hemispheres together, right? Here you can see in the bottom right the location of the cerebellum with respect to the cerebrum. So here would be cerebrum up here. Here would be diencephalon, brainstem, and then here's our cerebellum back here. And you can see these white matter tracts branching out. You can also see it up here as well, these white matter tracts branching out that are the arbor vitae, right? So when you look at the cerebellum, what the cerebellum is doing is, as we said, it's coordinating muscle movement, balance, posture. It has input. It also has output as well. And so what you have is you have information coming in and information coming out, right? So there are fibers that are called mossy fibers. And these mossy fibers are these purple ones here that bring sensory information into the cerebellum. You relay that to these cells called granule cells into these fibers called parallel fibers, and then you send the signal back out along a cell called a Purkinje cell. The Purkinje cells, which are these other ones in purple here, these go to a region called the deep cerebellar nuclei. And you have generally four different types of cerebellar nuclei. But in general, you send the information to these nuclei, they process it, and then from those cerebellar nuclei, those send information back out of the cerebellum, largely through the superior cerebellar peduncle, through the midbrain. They go up to the thalamus, and then from the thalamus, it can go up to the cerebral cortex. And then from the cortex, it's receiving this modified signal from the cerebellum, and then it can send us a motor signal out to the periphery. An important thing with the cerebellum that I'll note is that the cerebellum is controlling the ipsilateral side of the body. So one hemisphere of the cerebellum sends signals to that same side of the brain, and it also controls that side of the body. So the right hemisphere is receiving information from the right side of the body, left hemisphere is receiving information from the left, and they regulate and they control their respective side of the body. Okay. So we will stop here with this part, and we will pick up in the next part, part 4, by discussing specific pathways, specific types of motor pathways.